The car is sitting at the edge of the world, where pavement gives up and the river begins. It's early, still dark enough that the water looks like one long shadow. A patrol officer rolls through Peachtree Landing on a routine pass and sees a green Dodge Intrepid parked in a way that doesn't match the quiet around it. No person nearby, no movement, just a locked car at a boat landing, in the middle of the night, in a place most people don't visit at 4 o'clock in the morning unless they have a reason. And this is where the timeline starts to tighten, because only minutes earlier, according to the call records later laid out in court, Heather Elvis's phone made its last known call from this area. Heather was 20 years old, a daughter, a friend, a young woman with a life that was still unfolding, with ordinary routines and future plans that didn't include becoming a national headline or a decade-long argument online. And yet, the case that formed around her disappearance would become exactly that, a story told and retold, argued and weaponized, with a core that remains painfully simple. Heather left her apartment in the early morning hours. She ended up near a remote boat landing. Her phone activity stopped, and she has never been found. Before we go any further, I want to be careful about what we say with certainty and what we don't. In this case, two people, Sydney and Tammy Moorer, were convicted of kidnapping and conspiracy to kidnap Heather. Sydney Moorer was also convicted earlier of obstruction of justice related to lies and omissions during the investigation. Those convictions are facts in the legal record, but Heather's body has never been recovered, and there is no murder conviction. That means some questions can be answered with evidence and court findings, while the biggest question, where Heather is, remains unresolved. So tonight, we're going to do this the responsible way. We're going to build the timeline step by step, separate what is confirmed from what was argued in court, and tell Heather's story without turning her into a character in someone else's drama. Because the truth is, cases like this don't just harm the missing person. They harm the people who love them, and sometimes they harm the public's ability to see what actually matters. And what matters here, what the court record keeps circling back to, is a phone call that didn't come from a cell phone tower, didn't flash a familiar name on the screen, and didn't feel like evidence in the moment it happened. It came from a payphone. Imagine how that feels, even before you know what it means. You're a young woman alone in your apartment in the early hours of the morning. Your phone rings. It's not a normal call. The number isn't one you recognize. It's a payphone, and the voice on the other end belongs to someone connected to a part of your life you've been trying, maybe imperfectly, to step away from. That moment is the hinge of this case. Because after that call, the next hours become a chain. Fear, decisions made fast, calls returned, missed calls, movements tracked by location data, and then silence. Here's what we know from the record about the relationships surrounding Heather in late 2013. Heather Elvis lived in the Myrtle Beach area. She worked. She had friends and a roommate. She had been involved in a months-long affair with Sydney Moorer, a married man older than her. Court documents describe the affair as having ended on November 2, 2013. After it ended, or after one side believed it ended, tension didn't disappear with it. Instead, the case record describes escalating conflict, anger, and suspicion. And those emotions, according to prosecutors, became motive. But motive is not a timeline. Motive doesn't tell you what happened minute by minute, and in this case, minutes matter. So let's walk into the night Heather disappeared. On the evening of December 17, 2013, Heather went on a date with a man her age. That detail matters, not because it implies a neat storyline, but because it helps anchor something real. Heather was living her life. She wasn't frozen in a single relationship or a single mistake or a single rumor. According to the court narrative, the date seemed normal. Her date dropped her off at her apartment after 1 a.m. on December 18th. He is the last person known to have seen her in person. Meanwhile, Sydney and Tammy Moorer were together that night by their own admission, and phone location data discussed in the appeal record placed them moving through Myrtle Beach in those hours. Prosecutors later argued that the Moorers' movements, purchases, and communications that night were not random. And then, at around 1:15 a.m., the record says Sydney purchased a pregnancy test kit from Walmart. That might sound like a small detail, almost mundane, except in this case the rumor, or fear, that Heather might be pregnant was described as a pressure point. It's one of those facts that can be interpreted in different ways depending on which side you believe, but it's a marker on the timeline, and markers are what keep us honest. After that purchase, the record places Sydney and Tammy near a Kangaroo Express gas station. And at 1:33 a.m., surveillance video described in the appellate opinion shows Sydney leaving his truck and placing a call to Heather from a payphone outside that gas station. The call lasted about 4 minutes and 50 seconds. That call is the first time, according to the record, that Sydney called Heather since the affair ended weeks earlier. And if you're wondering why a payphone matters in an age of cell phones, you already see it. A payphone is a way to make contact without using your own device, without leaving the same kind of personal trail. It doesn't erase a trail entirely. Surveillance cameras exist, receipts exist, but it changes the shape of the evidence. Now, what did that call mean to Heather in the moment? According to the court account, after receiving that payphone call, Heather called her roommate, Brianna Worrelman, who was out of town. And this is where the phrase, "a tip that arrived too late," starts to feel painfully real, because the roommate did what a good friend does. She listened. She tried to calm Heather down. She warned her not to do anything rash. In other words, the warning came. The advice came. But the case record suggests Heather still left. If you've ever tried to talk someone down from panic over the phone, you know how fragile those moments are. You don't have the full scene. You don't know what your friend is looking at, what they're afraid of, what they've been told. All you can do is say, "Please don't go, please wait, please sleep, please call me back." And you hope the words land in time. In this case, the record says Heather was upset and scared. Her roommate calmed her down and told her not to call Sydney back or do anything rash. But soon after, it appears Heather changed clothes into what the record calls her favorite outfit and left her apartment at 2:31 a.m., heading toward an area near Longbeard's bar. This is where the phone trail becomes almost maddening because it shows intent and hesitation at the same time. After leaving, Heather repeatedly called the payphone at the gas station, 9 times according to the court account. None of those calls were answered. Picture that. You've gotten a call that shook you. You go out into the night anyway, and then you can't reach the source of the call. You're trying again and again, and there's only ringing. No answer. Then, the record suggests Heather returned home for a period. Around 3:16 and 3:17 a.m., she called Sydney's iPhone. The first call went to voicemail. The second lasted a little over 4 minutes. If you're trying to understand why Heather would keep calling, it helps to step away from judgment and step into human behavior. People don't make the safest decisions when they're anxious, confused, or emotionally entangled. They don't always do what they said they'd do an hour earlier. They chase clarity. They chase closure. And sometimes they chase the version of the truth they want to believe. After that 4-minute call, the record says Heather left her apartment again and traveled to Peachtree Landing, a place where analysis of her phone location data suggested she wasn't in the habit of going. That matters because it points away from routine. It points toward a meeting, a destination, a decision driven by something outside her normal patterns. And once Heather's phone is at Peachtree Landing, the calls become even more urgent. The record describes Heather calling Sydney's phone multiple times from the landing. Calls at 3:38, 3:39, 3:40, and 3:41 a.m. all went to voicemail. The 3:41 a.m. call is described as the last call made from Heather's phone. After that, there's no further activity. So let's pause and anchor what we know so far. Heather was last seen in person after 1 a.m. She received a payphone call at 1:33 a.m. She called her roommate, upset and scared. She left her apartment, tried to call the payphone back repeatedly with no answer, then later had a brief phone conversation with Sydney. After that conversation, she traveled to a remote boat landing. She called Sydney's phone again and again from that location, and then her phone went silent. Now here's the haunting part. Not long after that last call, Heather's car is found at Peachtree Landing, unoccupied, locked, missing key personal items. A car that looks, from the outside, like someone parked it and walked away, except no one could find where she walked to. When police begin investigating, they do what you'd expect. They search the area around the boat landing and the river. They talk to the last known people in Heather's orbit. They look at phone records. And very quickly, they focus on Sydney Moore. Part of that focus comes from the relationship itself. Part comes from what investigators found when they looked at communication patterns. And part comes from what happens when law enforcement meets Sydney early in the investigation, and here's a version of events that later collides with video. According to reporting tied to the case, Sydney initially denied making the payphone call, and even questioned whether payphones were still around, until police confronted him with surveillance footage. That detail isn't just a character note. It becomes legally important because it goes to deception, and deception, when it affects an investigation, can become its own charge. And in Sydney's case it did. But before we get to court, there's another layer, Tammy Moore. Prosecutors later argued that Tammy's behavior after learning about the affair was not passive. The appellate opinion describes phone records and location data from the Moores' iPhones, painting a picture of anger, control, and fixation. It describes threatening messages sent to Heather after the affair was discovered. It describes a household where, according to testimony referenced in the opinion, Tammy took control of Sydney's phone for a period of time. Those are serious claims, and they matter because the state's theory wasn't that Sydney acted alone in a spontaneous moment. It was that both Moores were involved in luring Heather to Peachtree Landing. This is also where we need to be careful. A prosecutor's theory is not the same thing as a video of the crime. A theory is how the state connects dots into a narrative that a jury can evaluate. Defense attorneys, in turn, are paid to break that narrative apart, point by point, because maybe is not beyond a reasonable doubt. So what evidence did the state use to argue their case? One category was the phone trail we just walked through: calls, pings, location data, timing. Another category was surveillance video, not at Peachtree Landing itself, but along the road leading to it. According to the appellate opinion in Tammy Moore's case, 2 surveillance systems captured images of a pickup truck traveling between the Moores' home area and the landing in the early morning hours. One camera, about 5 minutes from the landing, showed a dark pickup truck heading toward the landing at around 3:45 a.m. and returning 9 minutes later. Another camera, even closer, 2 or 3 minutes from the landing, showed a dark pickup truck going toward the landing at 3:39 a.m. and returning at 3:46 a.m. The opinion notes that the time stamps weren't synchronized, leaving a few minutes of variation. That might sound like a minor technical detail, but it's exactly the kind of detail trials live on. Minutes are where reasonable doubt is argued. To connect that truck to the Moores, the state called a forensic video analyst, Grant Fredericks. The opinion describes Fredericks conducting tests, including what it calls a headlight spread pattern analysis, and forming the opinion that the truck in the video footage was the Moores' Ford F-150. The defense didn't accept that quietly. In Sydney's appeal record, a defense expert testified that there was no way to scientifically prove the vehicle was the Moores' truck because the image contained nothing unique, though he agreed it was likely a Ford F-150. This is the tug of war. The state says, look at the totality, look at the method, look at the match. The defense says, you can't claim certainty from grainy video and timing gaps. And then, there are the behavioral details that prosecutors argued showed consciousness of guilt, actions taken after the disappearance that, in their view, weren't the actions of innocent people. In Tammy's appeal record, the opinion describes police visiting the Moores' home on December 20, 2013, roughly a 5-minute drive from Peachtree Landing. It describes a home surveillance system Tammy said did not work. It describes a black Ford F-150 that Tammy told police could not be unlocked at the time. It also describes items observed near a parked camper, a bag of cement, a spent shotgun shell, and cleaning fluid. And it notes that the day after police visited, Sydney purchased a new home surveillance system. Those details were used by prosecutors to argue planning, concealment, and cleanup, without needing to prove exactly what happened to Heather physically. And that's important, because the charges that ultimately stuck in court were kidnapping and conspiracy to kidnap, not murder. Kidnapping can be proven by showing someone was lured, confined, or carried away unlawfully. It does not require recovery of a body. But how do you prove kidnapping when the victim is missing and can't testify? You do it the way prosecutors often do in no-body cases, with circumstantial evidence that forms a net. Not one rope, but many cords braided together. Calls, pings, video, purchases, patterns, statements, and the sudden absence of the victim from every part of their life. And if you're listening closely, you'll notice what I haven't done. I haven't told you exactly what happened at Peachtree Landing, because no one can say with full certainty publicly, in a way that answers every question. That's the core of the tragedy. The evidence can persuade a jury that a crime occurred and who was responsible for it, without giving a family the final, physical truth of where their loved one is. That's why this case has lasted so long in public imagination. It's not just the love triangle narrative, which is easy for strangers to gawk at. It's the fact that the final scene, Peachtree Landing, still sits there, real and unchanged, while the outcome remains incomplete. Now, to understand why investigators believe this wasn't a voluntary disappearance, consider what was left behind and what wasn't. Heather's car was found at the landing locked. Her phone, keys, and purse were not inside. If someone is staging a voluntary disappearance, they often take the tools needed to travel: money, identification, phone, keys. But in Heather's case, the phone stops, and the phone itself isn't recovered. That can mean many things, and it's a point where speculation rushes in. But in court, the state didn't need to prove every hypothetical. They needed to prove a criminal act was committed. We also have the emotional reality described around Heather that night. She was upset and scared, according to the roommate account referenced in the appellate opinion. Fear doesn't automatically mean danger, but fear plus movement to a remote location in the middle of the night, followed by total silence, is not a normal pattern. So, investigators keep digging. They look at phone data. They look at accounts and alibis. They look at who had reason to meet Heather at 3:30 in the morning and why. And then the case enters its next phase, court. The legal history here matters because it tells you how hard no-body cases can be. There were multiple trials related to this disappearance. Sidney Moore's first kidnapping trial ended in a hung jury and mistrial. Later, he was convicted of obstruction of justice. Later still, he was retried and convicted of kidnapping and conspiracy to kidnap. Tammy Moore was convicted of kidnapping and conspiracy to kidnap in her own trial. If you're wondering how a jury can hang once and convict later, it's not uncommon. Trials are human. Juries are made of people with different thresholds for doubt, different ways of interpreting technical evidence, different reactions to messy relationships. And when evidence is largely circumstantial, those differences matter. During Sidney's later trial and appeal, venue became an issue. The defense argued he couldn't get a fair trial in Horry County due to publicity and social media saturation, and also pointed to the fact that Heather's aunt was the Horry County Clerk of Court, raising concerns about the appearance of conflict. The appellate opinion describes how the court handled jury selection, excused potential jurors who said they believed Sidney was guilty or couldn't be impartial, and ultimately upheld the trial court's decisions on venue. This legal detail matters for another reason. It shows how the internet became part of the case itself. Heather's disappearance wasn't just investigated by law enforcement. It was investigated by strangers online, some well-meaning, some reckless, some cruel. Families in high-profile cases often face harassment and conspiracy theories that have nothing to do with evidence, and everything to do with people needing a story where they feel smarter than the police, or more morally pure than the victim, or more entertained by tragedy than they want to admit. So let's state this plainly. Harassing a victim's family is not true crime. It's just harm. The courtroom is where harm gets translated into rules, evidence rules, standards of proof, cross-examination. And in Tammy Moore's appeal record, you can see how the court framed the state's theory, that Tammy had control over Sidney's phone and actions, and that together they lured Heather to the landing by asking her to take a pregnancy test they had purchased. That's a specific claim, one that tries to explain why Heather would go to a remote location at that hour. It's also where you see how ugly cases can get when personal content becomes evidence. The appeal record discusses text messages, some sexually explicit, some referencing drug use, and the fight over whether they were more prejudicial than probative. I'm not going to repeat graphic or humiliating content here, because it's not necessary for understanding what happened to Heather, and because treating people like evidence exhibits is how empathy dies in public stories. What you do need to understand is this. The state argued those messages helped show phone control, motive, and a pattern of behavior. The defense argued they were character assassination and distraction. The appeals court ultimately affirmed the convictions. That leaves us with a strange, painful reality. The legal system reached a conclusion about kidnapping and conspiracy. But Heather is still missing. So where does that leave the story? It leaves it right back at that payphone, because the payphone call is the moment where the case turns from a complicated relationship into a measurable chain of events. It's the first domino we can timestamp with surveillance video. It's the call that led to the roommate conversation. It's the call that led to the repeated callbacks. It's the call that leads you, step by step, to Peachtree Landing. And it leaves us with the most human, least solvable question. What did Heather believe was going to happen when she left her apartment? Did she believe she was meeting Sidney alone? Did she believe she was being asked to do something that would end the uncertainty, like confirming a pregnancy rumor? Did she believe the danger was real, or did she believe she could handle it? Those questions are unanswerable because Heather can't tell us. And that's why this case hurts, because the missing person is the only one who could clarify what the fear felt like in her body in those minutes. But we can still talk about choices without blaming her for what happened. Heather was 20. The adults around her had more power, socially, emotionally, and in at least one case, within a marriage and family structure that may have included control and surveillance. That doesn't mean Heather was helpless. It means the stakes were uneven, and in uneven situations, young people often take risks they shouldn't have to take. If you're watching this and you've ever been pulled into someone else's secrecy, someone else's, it'll be different soon, someone else's meet me just for a minute, you already know how easy it is to lose your footing. Not because you're foolish, but because you're human. Now, one of the most emotionally difficult aspects of the case record is the idea that Heather may have been pregnant. The appellate opinion states that based on phone records, a search of her apartment, and statements from co-workers and her roommate, it became apparent she may have been pregnant with Sidney's child. That's the kind of detail that gets turned into gossip online, which is exactly what shouldn't happen. Pregnancy, possible pregnancy, shouldn't become a plot device for strangers. It matters only insofar as it may explain motive and urgency. In the state's theory, that possible pregnancy is part of what escalated tension and risk. In the defense view, the state's theory was speculation built from circumstantial dots. The court's job is to decide whether the evidence was sufficient to let a jury decide, and ultimately whether errors occurred that require a new trial. In these appeals, the convictions were affirmed. But for Heather's family, appeals aren't closure. They're paperwork around a hole in the middle of life. So let's talk about that hole carefully. When a person disappears, families often live in two realities at once. One reality is hope, because as long as you don't have a body, your mind can't stop trying to imagine survival. The other reality is fear, because the evidence points to harm, and your heart starts preparing for news you dread. Heather's case has forced her family and community to live in that double reality for years. And then there's the public. The public wants a clean ending. The public wants a confession, a map, a dramatic last-minute discovery. When they don't get it, they often fill the gap with imagination. That is where cruelty enters, and it's why I'm asking you directly, if you follow true crime, follow it with restraint. Don't message families. Don't tag them in theories. Don't turn their worst day into your entertainment. If you want to do something useful, the useful thing is simple. Keep Heather's name attached to the fact that she is missing, and if you genuinely have information, take it to law enforcement, not to social media. Now, you might be wondering, if the evidence was strong enough to convict on kidnapping, why hasn't Heather been found? Sometimes the answer is blunt. Sometimes the only people who know where a victim is will not say, because saying would add charges, add years, or destroy whatever remaining control they feel they have. In some cases, that silence becomes its own form of power. But sometimes, the answer is also environmental and practical. Peachtree Landing is near water. Water changes evidence. Terrain hides things. Time makes searches harder, not easier. And if the disposal, if that's what happened, occurred away from the landing, then the landing might only be the last visible checkpoint, not the final location. In other words, you can be convicted for bringing someone to the edge of a cliff, without the court ever proving exactly where they landed. That's why this case remains a missing case in the lived sense, even after convictions. It also explains why the timeline matters so much. If you can narrow the window, you can narrow the search. The appellate opinion gives us a window shaped by call times and surveillance times. Heather's last call at 3:41 a.m., the truck footage around 3:39 to 3:46 a.m., the officer seeing the car around 4 a.m. Those details create a corridor of minutes where something changed Heather's life permanently. And now let's return to the phrase, a tip that arrived too late, because in this story it isn't a hotline call. It's the voice of a roommate, out of town, trying to keep her friends safe with nothing but words through a phone line. She told Heather not to do anything rash. She calmed her down, and still Heather left. That's the part people rarely talk about with compassion, because it forces you to confront something terrifying. Sometimes the right advice doesn't work in time. Sometimes love on the other end of the line isn't enough to stop a person from walking into danger. And if you've ever carried the guilt of not being able to stop someone you love from making a choice, you already understand how long that kind of night can last in a person's mind. In the court record after that call, Heather called the payphone again and again, trying to reconnect. Imagine what her thoughts might have been, without claiming to know. Confusion, regret, anger, a need for answers, a need to feel like the decision to leave wasn't pointless. Those are human needs, and human needs can walk you right into someone else's trap. Prosecutors argued that trap was planned. They pointed to phone control, the pregnancy test purchase, the lure to the landing, and the truck movements. They argued that Heather was decoyed into going to a remote location. Defense attorneys argued the case was circumstantial and that the state couldn't prove what it claimed. A jury heard those arguments and convicted. And yet, even a conviction doesn't answer the question that keeps Heather's family awake. Where is she? In recent years, legal motions and appeals continued. Courts addressed arguments about fairness, pretrial publicity, and evidentiary issues. News outlets have reported on ongoing efforts by the convicted parties to seek new trials or relief, and on courts denying further appeals. That's part of the system. Cases don't end when the jury stands up. They echo through motions, filings, and appellate decisions for years. But in the human sense, Heather's case is frozen at 3:41 a.m., a final call that went to voicemail, and then nothing. So what do we do with that? We do two things. First, we remember Heather as a person, not a scandal. A young woman who had a life, made choices, made mistakes like all humans do, and still deserved safety, still deserved to come home. Second, we learn what this case teaches without extracting it like a moral lecture. Here's the clearest lesson. Secrecy is a risk multiplier. Relationships kept in the dark create leverage. They create pressure. They create people who feel cornered. And when people feel cornered, they do dangerous things. Another lesson is about technology. People think of phone data like a magic eye that sees everything. It doesn't. It gives you points, pings, probabilities, and patterns. It can build a powerful story in court. But it doesn't give you a map to a body. It doesn't replace a confession. It doesn't heal a family. And the last lesson is about the public. If you follow cases like this, don't become part of the harm. Don't feed rumors. Don't treat trials like episodes. Don't reward cruelty with attention. If you want to support ethical true crime, support creators who cite sources, who correct errors, who avoid sensationalism, and who keep the victim centered. If you're here for that kind of coverage, you can subscribe. I don't say that to grow a channel. I say it because the algorithm rewards extremes, and the only way to push back is to build audiences around restraint and accuracy. Now, before we end, I want to talk directly to the unanswered questions, the ones that remain even after reading the court record. Why did Heather go to Longbeard's bar area after the payphone call? Was she expecting to find Sydney there? Or was she simply trying to make contact in a place that felt more public than a boat landing? We can see the pattern of calls. We can see the movement. But we can't see inside the choice. Why were none of the payphone callbacks answered? If Sydney called from that payphone, why not answer when Heather tried to call back? Was the plan simply to initiate contact and then force her to chase it? Or did circumstances change? We can ask these questions without pretending we can answer them. What happened in the minutes between Heather arriving at Peachtree Landing and the end of her phone activity? The record shows calls to voicemail. It shows her trying repeatedly. That suggests she didn't immediately meet the person she was calling, or at least didn't have a stable connection. But then her phone stops. Did it get turned off? Destroyed? Taken? Dropped? We don't know. And finally, where is Heather? That is the question that matters most, and it's the one the public can't solve by posting theories. If Heather is ever found, it will be because evidence is discovered, or because someone who knows something decides, finally, to speak. If you are someone who has information, even something that feels small, the right place for that is law enforcement. Not a comment section, not a forum thread, not a TikTok. The internet can't process evidence. It can only process stories. And Heather doesn't need more stories. She needs truth. As we close, I want you to picture that boat landing again. The river, the dark water, the locked car, the last call at 3:41 a.m. Picture the ordinary reality underneath the headline. A father getting a call that his daughter is missing. A family searching a shoreline. Friends replaying the last conversations in their minds. A roommate hearing fear through a phone line and wishing she could reach through the miles and hold her friend in place. That is the center of this case. Not the drama, not the spectacle, not the love triangle. A young woman is missing, and the people who loved her are still living in the echo. If you stayed to the end, thank you for treating this like a real person's life. If you want more long-form investigations told with this level of care, you can subscribe and turn on notifications, quietly, intentionally, so these stories don't get drowned out by louder, crueler versions. And wherever Heather is, the one thing we can say without hesitation is this: she deserved to be safe. She deserved to come home, and she still deserves to be found.